10-year-old Lily sat perfectly still at her desk, the morning sunlight streaming through the classroom windows and catching dust motes in the air. Her math worksheet lay untouched except for the small corner where her pencil traced the same pattern over and over. 3 quick taps, 2 slow ones, then a long pause that felt like holding her breath. Her fingers moved with deliberate precision against the worn wooden surface, each movement calculated, each pause measured. The rhythm wasn't random stimming. It was a language her mother had taught her during those quiet evenings at the kitchen table. 3 for danger, 2 for home, 1 long silence, meaning now. They'd practiced until Lily could do it without thinking, until the pattern felt as natural as breathing. Today, the pattern felt heavy, each tap carrying the weight of her mother's strained smile at the school gate that morning. Lily watched Ms. Evans from beneath her lashes, tracking the teacher's movement around the classroom. The soft swish of her skirt, the gentle click of her pen against the attendant's clipboard, the way she paused to adjust a crooked poster about kindness. Lily's world operated on patterns and predictability, and today, every pattern felt wrong. The morning had started with broken routines. Her mother forgetting to pack the usual apple slices, the car taking a different route to school, the goodbye hug that lasted too long and felt too tight. Her fingers continued their work. Tap, 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 tap. Pause. The pattern repeated like a heartbeat, steady and insistent. Other students worked quietly around her, their pencils scratching against paper, chairs squeaking occasionally. Nobody noticed the small girl in the third row, speaking without words. Nobody except Ms. Evans, whose footsteps slowed near Lily's desk, whose observant eyes missed very little in her classroom. When their eyes met, Lily didn't look away. She held the teacher's gaze, her brown eyes serious beyond her years, her expression a careful mask that almost hid the fear beneath. The tapping continued, each repetition a silent scream for someone to understand, to notice, to help. She remembered her mother's whispered words that morning, "Be brave today, my love," and the way her mother's hands had trembled when she'd smoothed Lily's hair. Miss Evans moved closer, her attention fully on Lily now. The teacher's face showed first curiosity, then dawning recognition. Lily saw the moment, understanding clicked into place, the slight intake of breath, the way Miss Evans's eyes widened just enough to show she'd remembered the community safety workshop, the presentation about nonverbal distress signals for children who couldn't speak their danger aloud. The classroom phone sat on the wall near the reading corner, its red emergency button gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Lily watched Miss Evans glance toward it, then back at her, a question in her eyes. Lily gave the smallest nod she could manage, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone must hear it. The tapping pattern continued. More urgent now, each repetition shouting what her voice couldn't form into words. When Ms. Evans finally moved toward the phone, her steps measured and calm, despite the urgency in her eyes, Lily felt the first flicker of hope she'd known all day. The teacher kept her voice low, her back to the class, but Lily saw the way her shoulders tensed as she spoke into the receiver. She watched the subtle nod Ms. Evans gave her when she hung up, the reassurance in that small gesture that said, help was coming, that someone had finally understood her silent language. The waiting began then. 15 minutes that stretched into what felt like hours. Lily kept tracing patterns on her worksheet, her movements now more relaxed, the urgent edge gone from her tapping. She watched the classroom door, counting the seconds, breathing in time with the clock's steady tick. When the intercom finally called Ms. Evans to the principal's office, Lily knew the help had arrived, that the pattern had worked, that her silent cry had been heard. The principal's office felt different today. Not the usual space of lost lunchboxes or playground disagreements. 2 police officers stood near the window, their uniforms crisp and serious, but their faces held a gentleness that made the room feel safe rather than scary. Miss Evans stood beside the principal, her hands clasped tightly together, her knuckles pale. She watched Lily's reaction, ready to step closer if the girl needed her. The older officer knelt slowly, bringing himself to Lily's eye level. His voice was calm, like the deep hum of the classroom air conditioner. He explained they'd gone to her house after receiving a very special message. They found her mother safe but upset, and they were helping her now. He didn't use scary words or loud voices. He spoke about patterns and signals and how brave it was to use them when you need help. Lily's mother had taught her the tapping code after seeing a program about nonverbal communication for autistic children. They'd practiced during calm evenings, turning it into a game at first. 3 taps for I love you, 2 for cookie please, 1 long pause for I need space. But they'd also practiced the emergency version, the one that meant danger at home and immediate help needed. They'd never thought they'd actually need it. The officer showed Lily a small card with the same tapping pattern drawn on it. 3 dots, 2 dashes, a long line. He explained how dispatchers are trained to recognize these signals now, thanks to workshops with autism advocacy groups. The system was designed precisely for children like her, for moments when words won't come but danger speaks loudly in other ways. Ms. Evans listened, her heart swelling with pride for the small girl sitting so quietly. She remembered her own hesitation that morning, the professional doubt that made her question whether she was reading too much into a child's repetitive behavior. That moment of uncertainty felt like a lifetime ago now. She watched Lily absorb the officer's words, her serious expression slowly softening into something like relief. The principal explained the safety plan they were putting into place. A social worker would meet Lily after school today. There would be counseling available, both for her and her mother. The school would provide additional support in the classroom, perhaps a quiet corner where Lily could retreat if things became overwhelming. Ms. Evans nodded along, already mentally rearranging her classroom to create that safe space. Lily focused on the pattern the officer had drawn. 3 quick, 2 slow, 1 long pause. She traced it with her finger on her knee, the movement familiar and comforting now. This pattern had brought help. This pattern had made adults listen. This pattern had kept her mother safe. She looked up at Ms. Evans and gave the smallest of smiles, a silent thank that needed no translation. The officers stood to leave, their job done for now. They praised Lily's courage again, their respect genuine. One of them mentioned they'd be checking in with the family regularly, that the safety plan would continue as long as needed. They shook the principal's hand, nodded to Ms. Evans, and left the office as quietly as they'd arrived. In the sudden stillness, the principal turned to Ms. Evans. They discussed how to handle the rest of the school day, whether Lily should return to class or spend time in the quiet library corner. They agreed normalcy would likely be most comforting, but with the understanding that today wasn't a normal day. Ms. Evans would keep a careful watch, offer extra reassurance, be ready to adapt if needed. Lily watched this adult negotiation with quiet understanding. She appreciated that they included her in their glances, that they didn't talk about her as if she weren't there. When they asked if she felt ready to return to class, she nodded. The worksheet awaited, the familiar routine called, and she wanted to sit at her desk, knowing help had come because she asked for it in her own way. As they walked back down the hallway, Ms. Evans kept her hand lightly on Lily's shoulder, not restraining, just connecting. The classroom door stood open, the hum of student activity drifting into the corridor. 20 pairs of eyes looked up when they entered, curious but not overly so. 4th graders understood when something important had happened, even if they didn't know the details. Lily took her seat, the familiar wooden desk feeling like an anchor in a morning that had been anything but normal. She picked up her pencil, not to tap out distress signals anymore, but to actually work on her math problems. The numbers lined up in their predictable rows, the equations following their reliable patterns. For the first time that day, the world felt ordered again. Ms. Evans moved through the classroom, checking work, offering quiet praise, her attention constantly circling back to Lily. She noticed how the girl's shoulders had relaxed, how the tension had drained from her small frame. The tapping had stopped completely, replaced by the steady scratch of pencil on paper. The silent cry had been answered, the signal decoded, the help delivered. The classroom settled into its afternoon rhythm, but nothing would ever be quite the same again. The classroom phone felt heavy in Ms. Evans's hand, its familiar plastic shape suddenly transformed into an instrument of immense consequence. She kept her back to the students, her voice low and measured as she pressed the receiver to her ear. The dispatcher's professional calm provided an anchor in the storm of her racing thoughts. 911, what's your emergency? The words were routine, but nothing about this moment felt routine. Ms. Evans took a steadying breath, her eyes fixed on Lily's small form at the third-row desk. "I'm calling from Pine Grove Elementary," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have a student using a nonverbal distress signal we discussed in last month's community safety workshop." She described the pattern: 3 quick taps, 2 slow, 1 long pause, and watched Lily's shoulders relax almost imperceptibly at her words. The dispatcher's tone shifted immediately from routine to focused. "You're referring to the autism safety protocol? Confirm the pattern sequence, please." Ms. Evans repeated the tapping rhythm, adding that the student had made deliberate eye contact, and her body language indicated genuine distress rather than self-stimulating behavior. She could hear the dispatcher typing rapidly, the clicks echoing through the phone line like punctuation marks to this extraordinary moment. "Address is 428 Maple Avenue," Ms. Evans continued, reciting the information from memory. Lily's emergency contact form flashed through her mind, the careful handwriting, the mother's note about communication preferences, the medical alert about her autism diagnosis. All those administrative details suddenly felt vitally important rather than paperwork to be filed away. The dispatcher confirmed the address, then asked the question that made Ms. Evans's stomach tighten. "And you're certain this isn't regular classroom behavior for this student?" She watched Lily's pencil moving steadily across the math worksheet, the pattern now less frantic but still consistent. The girl's concentration was absolute, her focus on the task both typical and utterly different from her usual classroom engagement. "Yes," Ms. Evans said firmly, pushing aside her lingering professional doubts. "This is deliberate communication." Her eye contact was specific, her body language tense in a way that suggests awareness rather than overwhelm. She described how Lily had watched her approach the phone, how the tapping had intensified when other students moved nearby, how the pattern had remained perfectly consistent. Rather than varying as stimming behaviors typically would, the dispatcher's next words brought both relief and heightened urgency. "We're dispatching officers immediately. They're trained in the nonverbal signal protocol. Stay with the student if possible. Maintain normal classroom routine and wait for our arrival at the school." The instructions were clear, professional, and terrifying in their implications. Ms. Evans's hand trembled slightly as she hung up the phone, the click of the receiver sounding final and irreversible. She turned back to her classroom, 20 pairs of eyes looking up from their work with mild curiosity. Only Lily kept her head down, her pencil moving steadily across the paper, but Ms. Evans noticed the slight relaxation in her shoulders, the barely perceptible easing of tension around her mouth. The message had been received, the call had been made, and now they waited. Ms. Evans moved through the classroom with forced normalcy, stopping to check math problems, offering quiet words of encouragement, all while her attention remained divided between the classroom door and Lily's desk. The clock above the whiteboard seemed to slow, each tick of the second hand stretching into eternity. She found herself counting breaths, matching her own to the steady rhythm of Lily's now calm tapping. The other students sensed the shift in atmosphere, despite Ms. Evans' efforts at maintaining routine. They worked more quietly than usual, the usual rustling and whispering replaced by an unusual stillness. A few glanced curiously at Lily, then at their teacher, picking up on the unspoken tension without understanding its source. Children are remarkably perceptive to emotional currents, even when the adults think they're hiding them well. Lily herself had transformed since the phone call. The desperate edge to her movements had vanished, replaced by a focused determination. She completed math problems with unusual speed, her pencil moving efficiently across the page. Occasionally, she would glance toward the classroom door, her expression watchful, but no longer fearful. The pattern continued beneath her hand, but now it felt more like confirmation than cry for help. Ms. Evans found herself marveling at the child's composure. Under circumstances that would have overwhelmed many adults, this 10-year-old girl had communicated her need with incredible precision, waited patiently for response, and now maintained perfect classroom decorum while knowing help was on the way. The professional development workshops had discussed the intelligence and resilience of nonverbal children, but seeing it firsthand was profoundly different. 15 minutes passed with glacial slowness. Ms. Evans continued the math lesson, calling students to the board to solve problems, handing out worksheets, doing all the normal things while her internal awareness remained fixed on the hallway beyond the classroom door. She noticed when Lily began a slight rocking motion, a self-soothing behavior she'd seen before during stressful moments, but now it seemed calming rather than distressed. The intercom buzzer made everyone jump, the sound unusually loud in the tense quiet. The office secretary's voice came through, crisp and professional. "Ms. Evans, could you please come to the principal's office? Bring your attendance folder." The coded message was clear. The police had arrived and needed to speak with her privately. Ms. Evans took a moment to compose herself, smoothing her skirt and taking a deep breath. She addressed the class with practiced calm. "I need to step out for a moment. Continue with your independent reading until I return. Lily, would you please hand out the reading logs?" The request was deliberate, giving Lily a small responsibility, something to focus on during her absence. Lily nodded solemnly, rising to collect the reading logs from Miss Evans's desk. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment an entire conversation passed between them without words. Miss Evans's look said, "I understand. Help is here. You're safe." Lily's slight nod in return said, "Thank you. I trust you. I'll be okay." The exchange lasted less than 3 seconds, unnoticed by the other students, but profoundly meaningful to both teacher and child. As Miss Evans walked toward the principal's office, her footsteps echoed in the suddenly empty hallway. The normal sounds of other classrooms, teachers lecturing, students reciting, chairs scraping, faded into background noise as she approached the office door. Her hand hesitated on the knob, the weight of what she might learn on the other side, making her pause for just a moment before turning it. Inside, the principal sat with 2 police officers, their uniforms adding a seriousness to the usually cheerful office with its student artwork and motivational posters. They stood when she entered, their expressions professional but kind. The older officer extended his hand. "Ms. Evans, we responded to the welfare check at 428 Maple Avenue. We'd like to discuss the situation and next steps." The principal gestured toward a chair, her face a careful mask of professional calm that didn't quite hide her concern. "The officers have been briefed on the non-verbal signal protocol," she explained. "They're familiar with the training we received last month." Ms. Evans nodded, her attention fixed on the officers, waiting to hear what her phone call had set in motion. The younger officer spoke next, his voice gentle. "We found the mother safe, but in significant distress. There was a domestic situation developing when we arrived. Your call prevented what could have become much more serious." He explained they'd connected the mother with crisis services and a social worker was already en route to the home. The immediate danger had been addressed, the situation stabilized. Ms. Evans felt a wave of relief so profound it made her lightheaded. Her professional training had kicked in automatically during the crisis, but now the emotional weight of what had almost happened settled over her. She thought of Lily sitting in her classroom, completing math problems while police officers intervened in her home life. The incredible courage it must have taken for that child to use their practiced signal, to trust that someone would understand. The officers explained the safety plan they were implementing, regular welfare checks, connection with domestic violence resources, ongoing support from social services. They praised the school's implementation of the non-verbal signal program, noting how rare it was to see it used effectively in real situations. "Most times," the older officer said, "these protocols remain theoretical. Today, it made all the difference." The principal discussed how they would handle the remainder of the school day. Lily would stay in class rather than being pulled out, maintaining normalcy being the priority now. The social worker would meet her at dismissal rather than interrupting the school day. Ms. Evans would provide quiet support and watch for any signs of additional stress. They agreed that routine would be Lily's anchor in this suddenly changed world. As the meeting concluded, the officers stood to leave. The older one paused at the door, turning back to Ms. Evans. "You should know," he said quietly. "The mother specifically asked us to thank you. She said she taught Lily that signal, hoping she'd never need it, but grateful beyond words that when she did, someone was watching closely enough to understand. Those words stayed with Miss Evans as she walked back down the hallway toward her classroom. The weight of responsibility felt different now, not burdensome, but sacred. She paused outside her classroom door, watching through the small window as her students read quietly. Lily sat at her desk, a reading log completed neatly before her, her posture calm and focused. The crisis had been averted, the help had arrived, and now the healing could begin. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and opened the classroom door. 20 faces looked up from their books, but only one pair of eyes held understanding of what had just transpired. Miss Evans met Lily's gaze and gave a small, reassuring nod. The silent conversation continued. "I'm here, you're safe, we'll get through this together." And in that moment, both teacher and student understood that something fundamental had changed, not just about today, but about how they would move through the world from now on. The afternoon sunlight slanted through the classroom windows, casting long shadows across the finished math worksheets and quiet reading logs. Lily sat perfectly still at her desk, her hands folded neatly in her lap where they had finally stopped their urgent tapping. The rhythm still echoed in her mind. 3 quick, 2 slow, 1 long pause. But now, it felt like a victory march, rather than a distress signal. She watched Miss Evans move about the classroom, collecting papers and offering quiet words of praise, and felt a strange new sensation blooming in her chest. It wasn't just relief that help had come. It was the dawning understanding that her voice had been heard, even when it couldn't form words. Lily replayed the morning's events in her mind, each moment crisp and clear like the pages of her favorite picture books. Her mother's unusually tight hug at the school gate, the whispered words that tasted like fear, the different route they'd taken to school, avoiding their usual streets. She had known something was wrong before she could articulate what wrong meant. The patterns were off, the rhythms broken, the safety of predictability shattered. Her world operated on consistency, and today, every consistent thing had become unreliable except for one, the emergency patterns she and her mother had practiced. She remembered the exact moment she decided to use the signal. It came during morning math, when the numbers on her worksheet started swimming and the classroom sounds became too sharp and painful. The panic had begun as a tightness in her chest, a feeling she usually managed by counting breaths or focusing on a single fixed point. But today was different. Today the fear had a name and a shape, and it lived in the memory of her mother's trembling hands, smoothing her hair that morning. So she started tapping. 3 for danger, 2 for home, 1 long silence, meaning now. The waiting had been the hardest part. Watching Miss Evans from beneath her lashes, wondering if the teacher would understand, or if the pattern would just look like another autistic behavior to be noted and accommodated. When their eyes met across the classroom, Lily saw the moment of recognition. Not the usual patient teacher look, but something sharper, more urgent. She saw Ms. Evans remember the safety workshop, saw the pieces click into place. That moment of understanding felt like someone throwing a lifeline across a widening river. Now, sitting in the peaceful afternoon classroom, Lily felt the weight of what had happened settling over her. The police officer's quiet explanation in the principal's office, the way they'd knelt to speak to her at eye level, their calm assurance that her mother was safe. All these things rearranged themselves in her mind into a new understanding of how the world worked. Adults could be trusted. Systems could work. Her way of communicating, different though it might be, could be effective when it mattered most. She thought about the social worker who would meet her after school, the safety plan the officers mentioned, the changes that would come. Normally, change frightened her, made her want to retreat into familiar routines and predictable patterns. But this change felt different. This change felt like protection rather than disruption. This change meant her mother would be safer, their home would be calmer, the world would make sense again. Lily watched her classmates packing up their books, chattering about after-school plans and playground games. They didn't know what had happened today. They saw the same Lily who always sat quietly in the 3rd row, who sometimes rocked during stressful moments, who communicated best through her tablet or careful gestures. But she felt different inside. The quiet girl who usually felt like an observer in her own life had become the protagonist in today's story. She had acted. She had communicated. She had changed things. Ms. Evans caught her eye from across the room and smiled. A real smile. Not the careful teacher smile she usually offered. Lily felt her own lips curve in response. A rare and genuine smile that felt unfamiliar on her face. In that exchanged look, she understood that Ms. Evans knew exactly how momentous today had been, how brave she'd been, how everything had changed because one small girl tapped a pattern on a wooden desk. The dismissal bell rang, its shrill sound usually jarring, but today feeling like music. Students scrambled to gather backpacks and line up at the door. Lily took her time, smoothing her worksheet into her folder, placing her pencil neatly in the desk groove, standing up slowly. She joined the line, her movements deliberate and calm. When she reached the classroom door, Miss Evans placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "The social worker is waiting in the office," she said softly. "Her name is Sarah. She's very nice." Lily nodded, her eyes serious. She took a deep breath, squared her small shoulders, and walked down the hallway toward the principal's office. Her footsteps echoed in the nearly empty corridor, each step carrying her toward a new version of her life where her voice mattered, her signals were understood, and her courage had made all the difference. Meanwhile, Ms. Evans watched Lily disappear around the corner toward the office, her own emotions swirling in a complicated dance of pride, relief, and lingering concern. She leaned against the classroom doorframe, the solid wood familiar beneath her hand, and allowed herself a moment to process what had just happened. The morning's events replayed in her mind with startling clarity. The pattern recognition, the phone call, the waiting, the revelation in the principal's office. Each moment stood out in sharp relief against the normal backdrop of fourth-grade routines. She thought about the community safety workshop that had seemed so theoretical just months ago. Sitting in the school auditorium on a Thursday afternoon, listening to police officers and autism specialists explain about nonverbal distress signals, she'd wondered if she'd ever actually use this knowledge. The scenarios had felt distant, something that happened to other teachers in other schools. Now she understood how vital that training had been, how those hours spent learning to recognize patterns beyond typical behavior might have saved a family today. Her classroom looked different now in the afternoon light. The same desks, the same posters about kindness and perseverance, the same reading corner with its well-worn pillows, but everything felt charged with new meaning. This wasn't just a place where children learned multiplication and grammar. This was a place where safety could be signaled without words, where trust could be built through observation, where a teacher's attention could literally change lives. The responsibility felt both overwhelming and sacred. Ms. Evans moved through the empty classroom, straightening chairs and gathering stray pencils, her movements automatic as her mind continued processing. She thought about Lily's incredible composure throughout the crisis, the precision of her tapping, the meaningful eye contact, the way she'd maintained perfect classroom behavior while her world was potentially collapsing. The intelligence and courage required for that level of self-control awed her. This wasn't a child who needed pity or special treatment. This was a child who deserved respect and admiration. She found herself reevaluating all her students through this new lens. The boy who hummed during tests, the girl who arranged her crayons in specific color orders, the child who needed to stand during lessons. What if these weren't just behaviors to manage, but communications to understand? What if each child had their own pattern language waiting to be decoded? The thought both excited and humbled her, expanding her understanding of what teaching truly meant. The principal appeared in the doorway, her expression a mixture of professional calm and personal concern. "She's with the social worker now," she said quietly. "They're connecting the mother with resources. It sounds like this has been building for a while." Ms. Evans nodded, her throat tight with emotion. They stood together in the quiet classroom, two professionals who had just participated in something far beyond lesson plans and standardized tests. "We should discuss how to support her moving forward," the principal continued. "Quiet space when needed, maybe some additional counseling resources. But mostly, she added with a slight smile. It seems like she just needs what we should be giving all our students: attention, understanding, and the space to communicate in their own ways. Ms. Evans thought about the subtle shift she'd need to make in her teaching approach, not just accommodating differences, but actively seeking to understand them, not just managing behaviors, but listening to what they might be saying. The nonverbal signal protocol had given her a specific language to recognize, but the larger lesson was about being present enough to hear what students couldn't say aloud. She glanced at the clock, surprised to see how late it had gotten. The hallway outside was quiet now. The buses departed, the building settling into its after-school stillness. In the silence, she could almost hear the echo of that morning's tapping. 3 quick, 2 slow, 1 long pause. The sound would stay with her, she knew, a permanent reminder of how much could be communicated when someone was paying attention. Gathering her things to leave, Ms. Evans paused at Lily's desk. She ran her hand over the smooth wooden surface where those urgent taps had sounded just hours earlier. The desk looked like any other 4th-grade desk, scratched and worn, with a faint pencil smudge along one edge, but today it had been a lifeline, a communication device, a place where courage had taken tangible form. As she walked out into the afternoon sunlight, Ms. Evans made a silent promise to herself and to all the children who would sit in her classroom. She would keep watching, keep listening, keep learning their languages. Because today she had learned that sometimes the most important messages don't come in words, but in patterns. Sometimes the bravest voices are the quietest ones, and sometimes being a teacher means understanding that every child has something to say, if only we're paying enough attention to hear it. The drive home felt different too. The familiar streets she traveled every day seemed sharper, more vivid, as if the crisis had scrubbed away the usual filter of routine. She found herself noticing details she normally missed: the way the late afternoon light caught the autumn leaves, the precise pattern of shadows from telephone poles, the rhythm of stoplights changing. Her world had been recalibrated by a child's tapping fingers, and nothing would ever look quite the same again. When she finally arrived home, the quiet of her apartment felt both comforting and strangely inadequate. She poured a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window, watching the neighborhood children playing in the fading light. Their shouts and laughter floated through the evening air, ordinary sounds from ordinary lives. But she knew now that ordinary could conceal extraordinary things: courage, fear, silent calls for help waiting to be answered. She thought about calling someone, her mother, a teacher friend, someone who might understand the weight of what had happened today. But the words felt inadequate, the experience too raw and personal to share yet. Some things needed to settle first, to find their proper place in her understanding before they could be offered to others. Instead, she took out her teacher planner and began making notes for tomorrow. Not lesson plans or curriculum objectives, but reminders to herself. Watch for patterns. Listen beyond words. Create space for different voices. Trust your instincts. The notes were simple, but they felt like the most important teaching preparation she'd ever done. As darkness settled outside her window, Ms. Evans finally allowed the tears to come. Not tears of sadness or fear, but of overwhelming pride in a child's incredible courage and profound gratitude that she'd been paying attention when it mattered most. The tears felt like punctuation to an extraordinary day, a necessary release before tomorrow's work began anew. She knew the memory of this day would shape her teaching forever. The image of Lily's serious face, the sound of that deliberate tapping, the weight of the phone in her hand, these things would become part of her professional DNA, woven into how she moved through classrooms and how she saw children. The crisis had passed, the help had arrived, but the learning would continue for a long time to come. And in that quiet evening moment, Ms. Evans understood that sometimes the most important lessons aren't the ones we teach, but the ones our students teach us about courage, about communication, and about the incredible power of paying attention. The Monday morning staff meeting felt different. The usual chatter about lesson plans and supply orders gave way to a palpable quiet as teachers settled into the library chairs. Ms. Evans stood near the front, her notes trembling slightly in her hands, though her voice remained steady. She hadn't slept much, the events of Friday replaying in her mind like a film she couldn't pause. But today wasn't about her feelings. It was about making sure every teacher in this building understood what had happened and why it mattered. She began not with the dramatic details, but with the patterns. How she'd noticed the consistency in Lily's tapping when typically her stimming behaviors varied. How the eye contact had been specific and purposeful rather than accidental. How the child's body language spoke of controlled anxiety rather than sensory overwhelm. She described the moment of recognition, remembering the community safety workshop that had seemed so abstract months ago, the sudden understanding that this wasn't just behavior, but communication. The other teachers listened intently, their usual morning fatigue replaced by focused attention. Ms. Evans saw recognition dawn on several faces as she described the tapping pattern. They'd all attended the same workshop, all received the same handouts, all nodded politely when the autism specialists explained nonverbal distress signals. But until Friday, it had been theory. Now it was breathing. Urgent reality. She explained how the system worked after her call, the dispatcher's immediate recognition of the protocol, the police response that prioritized discretion and understanding, the social services coordination that began before the school day even ended. This wasn't luck, she emphasized. This was a system working exactly as designed, because we were trained, because the dispatchers were trained, because everyone took the time to learn a language beyond words. The principal stood next, outlining the immediate changes. Every classroom would receive visual guides for the nonverbal signals, not just for autism, but for various situations where children might struggle to speak their needs. The office staff would receive additional training on recognizing coded messages. They'd create a quiet room, where students could decompress without stigma, staffed by rotating teachers trained in crisis response. But the most significant change came from the teachers themselves. Hands went up around the room, voices sharing observations and questions. The art teacher wondered about a student who only drew certain patterns when upset. The music teacher noticed how some children's rhythmic tapping during class might carry meaning they'd been missing. The physical education teacher asked about incorporating nonverbal check-ins during activities. What began as a briefing transformed into a collaborative planning session. Teachers who'd previously seen behavior management as separate from academic instruction now understood they were two sides of the same coin. The special education specialists moved through the room, offering insights into different communication styles, explaining how to distinguish between self-regulation and attempted communication. By the time the bell rang for first period, the staff meeting had run over by 20 minutes, but nobody seemed to mind. Teachers left not with additional paperwork, but with new perspective. Ms. Evans watched them go, noticing how many paused to look at the visual signal guides posted by the library door, how conversations continued in the hallway about particular students and their patterns. The transformation didn't stop at the classroom doors. The school secretary began paying closer attention to how children approached her desk, noticing that some students' seemingly random movements might actually be attempts to communicate discomfort or need. The custodian started recognizing when a child's pacing near the bathrooms might indicate anxiety rather than restlessness. The lunch staff observed eating patterns that sometimes signaled emotional distress rather than picky preferences. Lily's classroom became a quiet laboratory for this new approach. Ms. Evans created multiple ways for students to communicate needs without speaking: color cards for emotional states, tapping protocols for immediate help, a small signal flag system for those overwhelmed during group work. She normalized these tools for all students, making them part of classroom culture rather than special accommodations. The changes rippled through the school in subtle but profound ways. The boy who used to hum during tests now had a card system to indicate when the noise was self-regulation and when it meant he needed help. The girl who arranged her supplies in precise patterns could signal when this was calming ritual and when it indicated rising anxiety. Children who previously struggled to articulate their needs found new ways to be understood. Parents noticed the difference, too. At pickup and drop-off, they mentioned their children seemed more relaxed, more willing to discuss school, more confident in navigating the classroom environment. The parent-teacher conferences that month focused less on academic struggles and more on communication strategies that could be used at home as well. The district took notice. What began as one classroom's response to a crisis became a model for other schools. The special education director arranged for Ms. Evans and the principal to present at the next district-wide professional development day. They brought not just the story of Lily's emergency signal, but the practical systems they'd implemented, the visual guides, the staff training protocols, the partnership with local emergency services. Other schools began adopting similar approaches, each adapting the core principles to their unique communities. A school with more English language learners incorporated cultural communication styles into their nonverbal systems. A school with older students developed more age-appropriate signaling methods that respected teenage dignity while providing safety nets. The local police department took interest as well. The officer who had responded to Ms. Evans's call arranged additional training sessions specifically for school-based emergencies. They developed a closer relationship with the school district, with officers visiting not just for safety assemblies, but for a genuine connection with staff and students. Perhaps most importantly, the students themselves embraced the new communication culture. Children who previously felt frustrated by their inability to express needs now had tools to be understood. Students developed empathy for different communication styles, recognizing that everyone has moments when words fail, but the need to connect remains. Ms. Evans found her teaching transformed by the experience. Her lesson plans now incorporated multiple means of expression: visual, physical, written, spoken. She noticed more, assumed less, and created space for the quiet voices in her classroom to be heard in their own ways. The pressure to have all the answers lifted, replaced by the commitment to keep learning her students' languages. The classroom walls told the story of this transformation. Alongside multiplication charts and grammar rules hung visual guides to emotional states, calm-down strategies, and nonverbal signals. The reading corner included books about different communication styles and neurodiversity. The daily schedule included explicit time for checking in using various methods. Lily herself became a quiet ambassador for this new approach. She didn't speak about her experience, but her increased participation in class, her growing willingness to try new things, and her emerging friendships spoke volumes. She helped Ms. Evans develop new visual tools, her insight into what worked and what felt patronizing proving invaluable. The school's transformation became most evident during the annual Safety Drill Week. Where previously these exercises focused solely on external threats, now they included scenarios where students might need to communicate distress discreetly. Teachers practiced recognizing nonverbal signals. While maintaining classroom calm, students learned multiple ways to indicate need without drawing attention. As the months passed, the system's effectiveness showed in small but significant ways. A kindergartner used color cards to indicate bathroom anxiety before accidents occurred. A third grader tapped out a pattern to signal a bullying situation she was too embarrassed to discuss aloud. A fifth grader used the quiet room system to manage test anxiety that previously caused meltdowns. The school climate surveys that spring showed remarkable changes. Students reported feeling safer, more understood, more confident that adults would notice if they were struggling. Teachers reported feeling more equipped to support diverse needs, more connected to their students, more confident in crisis situations. Parents reported better communication from school and more tools to use at home. Ms. Evans sometimes paused outside her classroom door, watching her students move through their day with a confidence that hadn't been there before. She saw the subtle ways they communicated: a tapped rhythm, a color card flipped, a signal flag raised, and marveled at how naturally they'd embraced these new languages. The system's true test came not during another emergency, but in the daily moments of understanding that built trust between students and staff. The art teacher recognizing when a child's repetitive drawing indicated distress rather than creativity. The music teacher understanding when a student's rhythmic tapping meant, "I need help," rather than, "I'm enjoying the beat." The playground monitor noticing when a child's unusual stillness signaled trouble rather than calm. This transformation reached beyond the school walls into the broader community. local therapists began incorporating the nonverbal signal concepts into their work with clients. Parents shared strategies at community centers and playgrounds. The public library created visual communication guides for storytime sessions. The school board, initially skeptical about allocating time for yet another training initiative, became strong advocates after seeing the data on reduced behavioral incidents and improved school climate. They funded additional resources, supported ongoing training, and shared the model with neighboring districts. Ms. Evans found herself speaking at education conferences, her story of one Friday morning becoming a case study in the power of paying attention. She always emphasized that the real hero wasn't her observation skills, but the system that made that observation meaningful, the training that provided context, the protocols that enabled action, the community that supported implementation. As the school year drew to a close, the staff gathered for their final meeting. Where September's gathering had focused test scores and curriculum maps, June's meeting celebrated the human connections forged through better communication. Teachers shared stories of breakthroughs made possible by paying attention to nonverbal cues, of students who flourished when given alternative ways to express themselves. The principal presented Ms. Evans with a small award for excellence, but the real reward came from seeing how her colleagues had embraced this new approach. The art teacher had developed visual signal systems for her studio. The physical education teacher created non-verbal check-ins for sports activities. The music teacher incorporated rhythm-based communication into her lessons. On the last day of school, as students spilled out into the summer sunshine, Ms. stood at her classroom window watching them go. Lily paused at the gate, turned back, and raised her hand in a deliberate wave. 3 fingers extended, 2 curled, a momentary pause before continuing out to where her mother waited. The pattern was different now. Not a cry for help, but a message of gratitude and connection. Ms. Evans raised her own hand in response, her heart full with the knowledge that the system they'd built together would continue protecting and empowering children long after this school year ended. The transformation was complete, but the work of paying attention would continue. One observed pattern, one understood signal, one protected child at a time. The summer break stretched long and golden, but when September arrived with its sharpened pencils and crisp morning air, Lily walked through the school gates with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. Her backpack felt lighter somehow, though it carried the same supplies as last year. She moved through the familiar hallways with purpose, her eyes taking in the new classroom assignments posted by the office, the fresh bulletin boards bright with autumn themes, the way the morning light fell differently now that she'd grown 3 inches since June. She found her 5th grade classroom, not Ms. Evans's room this year, but Mr. Henderson's, and paused at the doorway to observe. The desks stood in clusters instead of rows. The reading corner featured beanbag chairs instead of pillows. The walls displayed maps and science posters instead of multiplication charts. Change usually unsettled her, made her want to retreat into familiar patterns, but today she felt curiously calm. She'd navigated bigger changes than a new classroom. Mr. Henderson greeted her at the door with a warm smile that reached his eyes. "You must be Lily," he said, not extending a hand for shaking, but giving a small wave instead. "Ms. Evans told me wonderful things about you." The mention of her previous teacher felt like a bridge between the known and unknown, a thread of continuity in this new beginning. Lily took her assigned seat, noticing how Mr. Henderson had placed her desk near the window where natural light would be best, but not directly in the sun's glare. Small considerations that spoke of someone who paid attention to details. She arranged her pencils in their familiar order, sharpened to perfect points, organized by color, and watched her new classmates arrive in chattering groups, their summer tans fading, their voices overlapping in excited reunion. The morning unfolded with the usual first-day routines. Name games, classroom tours, supply distribution. But Lily noticed subtle differences in how Mr. Henderson ran his classroom. He offered multiple ways to answer questions, raising hands, writing answers on small whiteboards, using thumbs up or down signals. He had color cards on every desk for students to indicate when they needed help or when they were understanding perfectly. The nonverbal communication systems that had been revolutionary last year now felt like standard practice. During math review, when the numbers started swimming on the page and the classroom chatter became overwhelming, Lily didn't panic. She simply flipped her color card to yellow, the signal for, "I need a moment," and Mr. Henderson nodded without making it a thing. He continued teaching while she took 3 deep breaths, counted the trees outside the window, and recentered herself. When she flipped the card back to green, he gave her a subtle thumbs up that said, "I see you. I understand. Take your time." This new normal felt both extraordinary and perfectly natural. The systems that had been born from her moment of crisis had become integrated into everyday classroom life, helping not just her, but countless other students who sometimes struggled to find their words. She watched a boy across the room use tapping patterns to indicate he needed the question repeated. She saw a girl use color cards to show she was feeling anxious about the assignment. The classroom hummed with silent communication that made space for everyone's needs. At recess, something remarkable happened. A second grader from the special education classroom stood frozen near the swings, her hands flapping in distress, overwhelmed by the noise and movement. Before teachers could intervene, 2 fourth graders approached her calmly. One tapped a gentle rhythm on her own arm, 3 slow, 2 fast, and the younger girl's flapping slowed as she focused on the pattern. The other fourth grader held up a blue card, the color for "I need quiet space," and together they guided the upset child toward a calmer area of the playground. Lily watched this interaction from the bench where she sat reading, her heart swelling with something she couldn't quite name. The systems worked. The understanding spread. Children were helping each other in ways that adults hadn't needed to teach because they'd absorbed it from the school's culture. The legacy of that Friday morning wasn't just in protocols and training. It was in how children moved through the world, seeing each other's needs and responding with compassion. After school, she stopped by Miss Evans's classroom. The door stood open, the familiar space both exactly the same and completely different. New students, artwork adorned the walls. Different books filled the reading corner, but the essential feeling remained, a place of safety and understanding. Ms. Evans looked up from her desk, her face breaking into a genuine smile when she saw Lily standing there. "They're using the color cards in Mr. Henderson's class," Lily said, her voice clearer and stronger than it had been last year. "And I saw kids on the playground helping a second grader who was overwhelmed." Ms. Evans nodded, her eyes shining. "It's spreading," she said simply. "Other schools are adopting the systems too. That thing you did, that brave thing, it's helping so many children find their voices." They talked for a few minutes about 5th grade, about summer, about the books Lily had read. The conversation flowed easily, without the carefulness that had sometimes characterized their interactions last year. Lily realized she was speaking in full sentences, making eye contact, asking questions. The confidence that had begun with her successful communication during the crisis had blossomed into broader self-assurance. As she walked home, the autumn leaves crunching under her shoes, Lily thought about how different this September felt from the last. The memory of that frightened girl tapping desperately on her desk seemed both recent and distant, part of her history but not her present. She'd crossed some invisible threshold from being a child who needed protection to being someone who understood how systems worked, how communication could transcend words, how bravery could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. Her mother waited at the gate, her smile easier now, the tension around her eyes softened by months of counseling and support. They walked home together, their footsteps falling into a comfortable rhythm. The safety plan had become routine rather than emergency. The social worker visits had tapered to occasional check-ins. The world had righted itself into a new configuration that felt stable and secure. That night, as Lily prepared for bed, she took out her journal, a new habit she'd started over the summer. She wrote about her first day of 5th grade, about the color cards and tapping systems, about the children helping each other on the playground. Her pencil moved smoothly across the page, the words coming more easily than they ever had before. The girl who once communicated primarily through patterns and signals now had pages filled with sentences and paragraphs, thoughts, and feelings, given shape through language. She paused, remembering the exact pattern she'd tapped that day. 3 quick, 2 slow, 1 long pause. The rhythm that had changed everything. She drew it in the margin of her journal, the familiar dots and dashes looking like musical notation or secret code. Then she wrote beside it, "This is how I asked for help. This is how they heard me. This is how things changed." The words felt important, worth preserving, not just for herself, but for other children who might need reminding that their voices matter, even when those voices don't use words. Even when those voices tap patterns on wooden desks or flip color cards or find other ways to say what needs saying. She closed her journal and placed it carefully on her bedside table. The moonlight through her window cast soft shadows across the room, illuminating the familiar shapes of her furniture, the books on her shelves, the world she moved through with increasing confidence. The fear that had once colored everything had receded, replaced by a steady understanding that systems could work, adults could be trusted, and her way of being in the world had value. As she drifted to sleep, the last thought that floated through her mind was that bravery isn't a single dramatic moment, but 1,000 small choices to keep moving forward. To trust when trust feels difficult. To communicate when words feel impossible. To believe that someone might be paying attention enough to understand. And sometimes, to be the one paying attention when someone else needs understanding. The legacy of that Friday morning continued to unfold in ways both large and small, visible and invisible, weaving itself into the fabric of a school, a community, and a young girl's understanding of her own strength. The patterns remained, but now they spoke of connection rather than crisis, of empowerment rather than emergency, of a future where every child could find their way to be heard. 5 years later, Lily stood at the high school podium, her graduation robe feeling both strange and familiar against her shoulders. She looked out at the sea of faces, teachers who had watched her grow, classmates who had become friends, family members, beaming with pride. Her fingers tapped a quiet rhythm against the polished wood, but this time it was simply habit, not a cry for help. 3 quick, 2 slow, 1 long pause. The pattern that had once been her only voice now felt like a reminder of how far she'd come. She began to speak, her voice clear and steady in the microphone. She talked about communication, about how everyone finds their own way to be heard. She didn't mention that specific Friday morning, but she spoke about the teachers who paid attention, the systems that supported difference, the courage it takes to trust that someone will understand. Her words reached across the auditorium, landing not as a story of crisis overcome, but as a testament to the power of being seen. If this story of quiet courage resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to remember that paying attention matters, that sometimes the most important messages don't need words, that being different doesn't mean being less heard. Subscribe for more stories about the moments that change everything, the small acts of noticing that transform lives, because every child deserves to have their pattern recognized, their signal understood, their voice valued, no matter how quietly speaks